Horror films are all political. Even if it's not explicit, the fear discussed in a horror film is. There's no exception to this rule. I literally dare you to find one. This film is about the Iraq War. This film is linked to gender politics. And this film speaks to the human fear of being unable to tame nature. So, what are you going to do about it? Much like horror films are political, they're inherently about borders. Here, the definition of borders can vary between film to film, but I would say that the fear stemming from horror films generally stems from the crossing of these borders. Leading up to the climax of David Robert Mitchell's It Follows, college student Jay and her friends walk to a swimming pool in their hometown of Detroit, Michigan. While walking through the city's many abandoned homes, Jay and her friends talk about the fact that when they were kids, their parents told them to never cross south of the 8-mile border. Jay's friend Yara then states that she later realized that this was because the 8-mile border is where the city started and the suburbs ended. In popular discourse, Detroit has been used as almost like a metaphor for the rise, fall, and reconstruction of the American dream through its pretty tumultuous history between the 1900s and the present day. Traditionally, the city has been talked about through the language of binaries and borders, through its present-day and historic racial divides, or the dichotomy between its ruins and its many new building projects. Since the mid-2010s, Detroit horror has become such a thing, with films like Don't Breathe, the newer Barbarian, and of course It Follows all being examples. And people are loving it. They are eating it up. Like, look at these people right here. They love it. The first time I saw It Follows in theaters in 2015, I wasn't really considering the setting of Detroit that much because I was honestly just focused on how scared I was. It follows the story of Jay, a college student who's been transmitted a mysterious disease which causes entities, taking on the form of random strangers or people you know, to walk towards you slowly. They'll never speed up, but if they do catch you, it's a really simple premise that's primarily been read for its portrayal of trauma relating to SA, the fear of inevitable death and decay, and its pretty direct link to the concept of passing along STIs. In 2016, Brett and Mock released an article titled It Follows from Inner City Detroit to the Suburbs in Bloomberg. This is such a great piece, and I really suggest you all check it out. I put a link in the bio. But essentially reading this piece was the first time I really considered the film's notorious shooting location. Growing up just like a huge horror nerd and also someone who's always been really interested in studying the environments and settings of films, I was really invested in the ways that the idea of borders in horror intersect with the idea of borders in cities. How do popular understandings of destabilized cities and communities and the boundaries of fear and safety intersect? Furthermore, do these films function as well-rounded social commentaries about Detroit's current social issues? In this video, I'm going to be discussing Detroit in horror films through the concept of borders, both literal and symbolic. And in order to do this, I'm going to be talking about 3 films, which I mentioned before: Don't Breathe, It Follows, and Barbarian. So we're going to come back to our discussion of these films in a second, but first I think it's important to just briefly understand the context of Detroit, kind of get to know what's been happening. I'm going to try to make this kind of brief because I don't want to linger too long on context, but if there's a specific topic that really interests you, I put some links to really interesting articles in the bio, so definitely check those out if there's anything you'd want me to elaborate on more. In 1899, the first American automobile plant, the Old Motor Vehicle Company, was opened on the riverside of Detroit, right here, ushering in the era of the Michigan auto industry boom. Giant plants like the infamous Packard plant were constructed, and by 1950, Detroit became the 4th largest city in America, with a population of over 1.85 million people. In the background of the automobile industry boom, racial tensions were beginning to grow within the city. Between 1910 and 1930, the Black population in Detroit grew from 1% to 9%. Because of this, a number of very racist measures were put into place to ensure segregation within the city. One of the most damaging and impactful measures was redlining, a very legal racial discrimination act that essentially meant that neighborhoods were graded based on a number of factors, like condition of housing, closeness to amenities, class, and race. These neighborhoods were then divided into colors. Green was best, blue was still desirable, yellow was declining, and red was hazardous. A neighborhood's appraisal would essentially determine bank lending decisions, so racialized communities were definitely affected by this. This, alongside the move of 3 major automobile plants to suburban areas in the 1950s, kickstarted a mass exodus of white Detroiters abandoning their city homes in favor of the deemed safer North. This mass exodus is often referred to as white flight. And these neighborhoods in the suburbs that white people were fleeing to often had white-only laws to ensure racial homogeny. The now predominantly black city neighborhoods were facing a number of systemic issues like lack of social services, crumbling infrastructure, housing discrimination, and police profiling. This all came to a head in 1967 when police raided a black speakeasy, prompting the 1967 Detroit riots. A 5-day riot which led to almost 1,200 injuries, 7,000 arrests of predominantly black rioters, and 43 deaths. Now, there was a lot of damage done during these riots, about $50 million worth of damage to buildings and businesses, and this left a lot of people homeless. It also really accelerated white flight with so many white people moving to the suburbs. And because of white-only laws, black citizens in the city kind of just had to stay and deal with it. By the 1980s, the racial segregation between the city and the suburbs was pretty shocking. In the city, most homes left by white people were left abandoned and to this day still sit in ruins. On some streets, only one house is occupied. At the beginning of the 20th century, Detroit was one of 4 major cities, and in the public eye is now perceived as being just like the failure of the American dream in a nutshell. On the other hand, in the past few years, Detroit has been working really hard to kind of turn its reputation around, and this has been done primarily through the rebuilding of its downtown and midtown neighborhoods. And while perceptions of the city are definitely shifting, there are some major issues in other parts of the city where residents are now forced to kind of just like figure out their own issues. And while the dichotomy of ruin and revival is certainly found within Detroit, this kind of hyperfixation on the black and white thinking about Detroit can be pretty harmful because it doesn't allow for imagining different kinds of Detroit futures, I guess. When in fact there are actually some really cool projects happening in a lot of these neighborhoods, focusing on rebuilding neighborhoods with the idea of community and sustainability in mind. Still, the image of Detroit as sitting in ruins and being beyond repair lives on. It's really not hard to understand why people would see Detroit as kind of like the perfect horror setting because of its history and the fact that a lot of people would probably perceive these abandoned streets to be eerie or unsettling. And films about unsettling built environments are like nothing new. That is like base level horror. Take the haunted house film, for example. In the 1970s, films like the Amityville Horror and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre depicted homes that were sites of terrible atrocities. These films have later been read as being about American economic anxieties of the time period. And later on, after the housing crisis of 2008, films like the Paranormal Activity series would similarly depict the unrest of anxious Americans and their middle-class economic situations. In Spook-onomics, the hidden economic metaphors in horror movies, Aditi Gupta writes on Don't Breathe and It Follows, stating that, quote, "In this neoliberal, albeit failing, a world which emphasizes privatization, accumulation by dispossession, and gives power to consumer capitalism, the middle class struggled hugely during the recession." Which, yes, this is factually correct. But I would say it goes a little deeper than that. Let's take Don't Breathe as an example. Okay, so Don't Breathe follows this girl, Rocky, and her 2 best friends, 13 Reasons Why, and this dude who, for some reason in this movie and in It Follows, is like the only non-white guy, and he dies first in both films, so slay. But basically, Rocky is stuck in a trailer park with a bad family situation, and she just wants to get the hell out of Detroit. And how's she gonna do that? Duh, by robbing a blind veteran's house. Come on. Now, the veterans' house is in South Detroit in a pretty rundown neighborhood and is the only occupied house on the block. So, after breaking into this guy's house, the three besties realize that this dude kind of has like otherworldly hearing and scent, and he's like a little bit eccentric, like he keywords and essays people. So, one really funny thing about this film is that like it's kind of the exact same concept as 8 Mile, but like twisted. It's like 8 Mile if you squint. Like, tell me it's not the exact same conflict, but with a white girl and not Eminem. And instead of winning a rap battle as a ticket out of Detroit, they rob a blind veteran's house. Obviously. So one thing that's important to note is that for the most part, this film actually wasn't shot in Detroit. Instead, the filmmakers built sets in Hungary and shot there. They got some external shots in Detroit where the film takes place on Buena Vista Street. But yeah, Buena Vista Street is a classically unkempt, mostly abandoned street in South Detroit. There's also one scene shot in an abandoned warehouse called... I'm gonna let my Hungarian friend take this one.
Nagy vásártelep.
And I would assume that the use of this giant abandoned market hall is a stand-in for the number of abandoned automobile plants found in Detroit, the most popular being the Packard plant. I actually thought, I was 100% convinced that this was actually shot at the Packard plant. So I wrote a whole thing about the Packard plant, but then I realized it wasn't. So that's good. But in my mind, this is just the Hungarian Packard plant, and it's my video, so I'm still going to talk about it. The Packard plant opened its doors in 1911. The plant gave jobs to tens of thousands of people before closing its doors in the 1950s. The plant is huge, spanning over, I think, 3,500,000 feet. And before its partial demolition in 2022, this was an extremely popular attraction for urbexers, but has also been used as the symbol of decline in the industrial golden age of Detroit and the United States at large. So Don't Breathe here essentially presents Detroit through two images, the abandoned factory and the abandoned neighborhood, two tropes representing Detroit primarily as a site of miserable urban decay. It's funny to me that this film kind of uses the same premise as 8 Mile, but centers the film primarily on white characters, because this kind of just erases all of the genuinely interesting politics discussed in 8 Mile, and then it's kind of just about white victimization and Detroit being miserable, and it's kind of weird. I don't even really know how to read the Detroit narrative in this film outside of the idea of white victimization within historically Black destabilized communities. If anything, this film is talking about white resilience, when the fact of the matter is there are a lot of predominantly Black activists in these areas who are working hard to rebuild their communities from the ground up. So, yeah. In Don't Breathe, Detroit feels almost claustrophobic. Like I said before, Rocky's main goal in the film is to get out of the city. To me, the house in the movie almost feels like a microcosm of Detroit itself. This confined, scary space with odd rooms and a sense of danger that you want to escape, but it keeps dragging you back in. The Detroit of Don't Breathe is one that confines the city's narrative to the popular imaginary. Once Rocky escapes the house, gets her money, and goes to the airport, she crosses a threshold into a feeling of safety. Not only from the evil blind man, but also from the dangers of Detroit itself. So, responding to Gupta's analysis of the film, sure, you can say it's about the recession. That would make a lot of sense, and the recession did heavily impact Detroit. But I would say more than being about the recession, it's about the white fear of the intercity, which is a little problematic given the history lesson we just had, maybe. So while Don't Breathe failed to represent Detroit beyond the idea of urban decay, the 2022 film Barbarian is kind of similar, but it also tries to unpack the history of these ruins and the decay. A lot like Don't Breathe, Barbarian is set in Detroit, but was actually shot primarily in Bulgaria. They created this neighborhood there and then shot some exterior scenes in Brightmoor, the neighborhood where the film takes place. Okay, this movie is it's really serious, but it's also really funny. Like, she's just so... She has a certain je ne sais quoi. I really enjoyed this film, actually, when I saw it in theaters. I feel like in the contemporary landscape of horror that wants to be crazy, these films are oftentimes kind of subdued, Sydney Sweeney. But this one wasn't afraid of just, like, going at it the entire time. I was, like, really excited, and also, like, I was just on the edge of my seat. I liked it, sorry. But aside from being a really crazy movie, there's also, like, a lot going on content-wise. Maybe even too much going on? Let's just get into the plot quickly. Basically, Tess and cousin It Skarsgård accidentally double book a rental house in Detroit in Brightmoor, and it's like, it's so sketchy. And then Girly Pop gets locked in the basement and finds a secret dungeon, and then gets kidnapped by mother, and there's a discussion of trauma and gender inequality and Detroit history and the ethics of rental units and cancel culture, and it's just like, chill. It's a lot. It's like, I'm lightheaded. Come on. Even from watching the trailer, it's pretty clear that beyond trying to create a social commentary, this film really wanted to just have like a lot of twists and wanted to keep you on the edge of its seat. And while I appreciate that, it definitely took away from like every single social commentary that the director Zach Krieger was trying to touch on, which, I don't know, kind of sucks. Like, I feel like he really did want to say something big about Detroit. Like, I feel like that's really evident, but he also wanted to say something big about like everything. So how does Barbarian understand and move through the space of Detroit? Essentially, we view the city through the eyes of the film's main character, Tess, who is in Detroit for a job interview and is unaware of some of the city's reputation. Tess chooses to stay in Brightmoor, another partially abandoned neighborhood in the south of Detroit. When meeting her potential employer in the newly booming and bustling downtown Detroit area, she is told that Brightmoor is a pretty sketchy area and that she should really consider moving neighborhoods for the rest of the trip. She doesn't, and go figure, she gets kidnapped by mother in the basement. So like I said before, one thing that Barbarian does try to do is kind of try to contextualize the neighborhood it is set in, being Brightmoor. We do a little flashback to the 1980s and we see the thriving, very white neighborhood of Brightmoor. Current resident of the now Airbnb that Tess is trapped in, Frank's neighbors are all moving out because, as one of them says, "Frank, this neighborhood is going to shit." I think that was a really good impression. We can pretty much infer that this has something to do with the white flight of the 1950s to the 1980s. There's also some talk of Reaganomics on the radio, because, you know, damn neoliberalism. But anyways, while most of his neighbors move out, Frank stays there and he K-words people and essays them and then has children with them. And then the children have children with the children. Then he hides in the basement for 40 years and no one finds out until Tess goes down there. And you might be wondering, how did no one realize that this horrible monster was killing people for 40 years? And that is the gag of it all. Like, oh my god, Detroit is so corrupt, of course no one would notice. The cops in Barbarian, much like in Detroit, only care about property and not people. Yeah, that's actually true. That's actually a good point. A lot like Don't Breathe, the main border being crossed in this film is found within the house. While in Don't Breathe, the barriers cross through breaking into and entering the blind vet's house. In Barbarian, the barrier is both the door to the house and the basement into the dungeon. The dungeon itself does not match up with our perception of the house, which is well-kept, suburban, and homey. The dungeon is dark and seemingly never-ending. There are cages and eerie videos about breastfeeding playing on old TVs. Like I said, this movie is all about twists and turns and false perception of people and places, something that was very intentionally done within the film. Like, for example, at the beginning of the film, Tess meets cousin It at the house, and we're not really supposed to trust him, but it turns out he's a pretty chill dude. Similarly, the unhoused man who runs up to and scares Tess ends up being the guy who kind of saves her and warns her about the house at the end of the film. So, You never know. When Tess first sees the Brightmoor neighborhood in the daytime, it really doesn't match up to her initial perception of the house. She really just like drove up there at night, saw the facade, saw the inside, and was like, cute. The first time she notices the kind of decay of the Brightmoor neighborhood, there's kind of like a switch. Like suddenly our general idea of safety is gone. The basement in many ways functions as an extension of the eeriness of the neighborhoods. But much like the rental listing can be deceiving, so too can Krieger's portrayal of the Brightmoor neighborhood. Brightmoor was, interestingly enough, actually a red line neighborhood, something that occurred well before the 1980s when the film suggests that the majority of white flight in this area appeared. Readus actually made a, dare I call it, goated video on the topic, and I would definitely consider checking it out. Again, link in bio. Go for it. He brings up this really great point in the video stating that this neighborhood was never actually all that white to begin with. And I think that's a plot hole that matters. Cinema's in. Go. A lot of people really like to simplify American issues, talking about Reaganomics and neoliberalism. Like the film really literally uses this through a radio clip about Reagan and the scene. And it's very true. I'm not trying to take that away. Like Reaganomics and neoliberalism like irreparably fucked up a lot of things in the US and worldwide, but I don't think, again, it's necessarily all that simple. The root of socioeconomic and housing racism in America has always been there, and Reaganomics simply served to make things worse. We can use the redlining of the 1930s as an example of this. Saying that Reagan's trickle-down economics are the prime reason for white flight is almost a bit lazy to me. And it removes responsibility from the argument. It's like if we use Trump as a scapegoat for all issues in contemporary America. It's like white liberal discourse, and in my opinion, it's kind of a cop-out. These are systemic issues that run really deep, and while it may be harder to portray, I think that it's at least important to consider. In creating a social commentary, there is, in my opinion, a big difference between showing a social issue and actually discussing the social issue. Like, I just have no idea what Krieger is adding to the discourse about Detroit. If things aren't how we perceive them, as Krieger suggests time and time again, then what about Detroit? I feel like Tess is constantly told that Brightmoor is a sketchy neighborhood, and then at the end it's kind of just like, yeah, that's true, Brightmoor is always sketchy. The end. Okay, so one topic that we haven't touched on yet is the mother in the room. And the mother, as we later find out, is a product of people making babies with people they're very closely related to. The reveal of this information, that the film's monster is in fact a tragic character, is really interesting to me. Much like my discussion of Reagan and the cyclical and systemic nature of American poverty and racism, the mother is the product of a long line of, well, evil. And frankly, I don't really know how to even read her place within the film. I don't know if this was intentional on Krieger's part, but if it was, it's kind of convoluted. One thing that I do know is that the mother is a horrific character who dwells in a horrific space. Her design challenges the idea of what a human body can look like. She certainly has human features, but she also embodies the feeling of horror and decay. In many ways, both her and the basement kind of embody the abject. In her influential text, Powers of Horror, an essay on objection, Julia Kristeva defines the abject as, quote, what defines identity, systems, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, unquote. These systems and orders speak to the ways in which we give meaning to people, places, and things. The abject, which exists outside of our systems of order, is often liminal. It borders life and death. It produces a feeling of sickness and disgust. Looking at a corpse reminds us of the fragility of the human body. When the it and it follows walks into Jay's house, it appears sickly and almost corpse-like. It urinates on her floor. It's uncanny and it's horrifying. Kelly Oliver writes that, quote, the symbolic can maintain itself only by maintaining its borders, and the abject points to the fragility of those borders, unquote. In horror cinema, like I said before, fear can oftentimes stem from the crossing of these literal and symbolic barriers. In It Follows, the It can technically take on any form, but more than not takes on the form of a sick or waste-producing body. Think the old woman in the hospital gown or the corpse-like woman wearing tattered clothes soiling herself onto Jay's floor. These uncanny bodies very literally confronting Jay through crossing the barriers of her home, her school, and her general idea of safety are all ones that would create a feeling of disgust, or at the very least, discomfort. They exist beyond the idea of safety or of the symbolic order. Of the three films I'm discussing, It Follows is actually the least overtly about Detroit. Like, the name Detroit is never actually mentioned. The closest we get is in the scene that I talked about in the intro of the video when Jay and her friends talk about crossing over the 8-mile line. That being said, it's also the only film that kind of challenges the notion of these borders within Detroit. Unlike Don't Breathe and Barbarian, the director Robert David Mitchell is actually from Detroit, and I feel like it's pretty evident. Firstly, this is the only film of the three that's actually shot on location, and secondly, it seems to be the only one that doesn't really fetishize the ruin aspect of Detroit, something that, as we've discussed before, is so easily exploitable within the genre. Jay and her friends live in the suburbs. We don't know much about her family's history, but for the sake of this video, we can posit that her family moved to the area sometime during the white flight of the 50s to the 80s. Something feels almost off about Jay's house. Like, sure, it's a pretty sizable property with a big yard and a swimming pool, but it almost seems kind of unkempt. The pool is dirty. This sounds mean. The pool is dirty, the design of the house looks like it's right out of the 80s. Yet the film's inclusion of technology such as this conch reader keeps the story firmly grounded in the present day. In It Follows, these homes are not presented as being safe havens, but instead as sites of slow decay and vulnerability. On Jay's date with Hugh, a man who would later go on to transmit the mysterious disease to her, the duo visits the Redford Theater, a well-known spot in the south of Detroit. While there, Hugh spots a woman in a yellow dress, a woman that he can only see. On their second date after hooking up, Hugh ties up Jay and brings her into the abandoned Packard plant in order to show her the first it and explain how the disease will function. He points at a naked woman slowly crossing over the border of neighboring train tracks towards the plant. While in the literal sense, these train tracks don't serve as any actual border in Detroit, historically, train tracks have definitely been used as borders between lower income and higher income areas. So I think that the crossing over of the train tracks is definitely an important border being crossed here. It just kind of represents the crossing over of the monster into Jay's life. While at school the next day, Jay encounters this old sickly woman. Honestly, by far the scariest it to me. Like, the first time I saw it, it made me just ever so slightly ageist. Like, to this day, if there's an old woman walking towards me, I'm kind of just like... Anyway, the woman looks sick, and this definitely represents the idea of sickness and, in a sense, decay. As she continues to encounter these abject figures, I think it's safe to say that Jay's home begins to decay a little more noticeably. We can see this through a shot of the family's pool breaking, left in an unusable state. While this can definitely be read in many ways, such as a loss of innocence, I'm interested in the ways in which the threat of decay moves beyond the bodily and into the environment of the film. Casey Ryan Anthony actually wrote a really great paper about It Follows, post-industrial horror and the crossing of borders, titled It Follows, Precarity, Thanatopolitics, and the Ambient Horror Film, which is super well written, and I definitely suggest you check it out if you're interested in that. In this essay, Kelly uses discussions of mapping and borders to argue that, quote, the film represents the suburbs as permeable, a crumbling facade of security, rendered vulnerable by the slow yet relentless creep of post-industrial decay, unquote. While Jay's backyard looks slightly unkempt from the beginning of the film, the pool breaking is a clear signifier that decay has permeated into the suburbs, creeping through the symbolic barriers of security developed by white families who fled the south of Detroit. So while a main source of horror in the film comes from this kind of creepy slowness, I want to talk about the two times that jump scares are actually mobilized within the film. The first is when the tall, breaks through the bottom of the door at the beach house. And the second is when the group of friends goes to find Hugh's house and a piece of drywall breaks down. What I find so interesting about these two jump scares, more specifically in the drywall scare, is that they're so based in the idea of the immediate, in the crumbling of already decaying things. There's a sense of both stagnation and immediacy within these decaying neighborhoods, speaking to the almost liminal space these destabilized communities are in. They're in dire need of change, but for decades now, the resources they need for this change have never been afforded to them. So as it turns out, the address that Hugh gave to Jay is fake. He actually lives in a pretty nice suburban area. Providing Jay with an address in the inner city almost makes it seem as though he felt a sense of security, kind of containing the monster within this area away from the suburbs. What we find out, though, through this film is that these borders that supposedly are supposed to create a sense of safety are so permeable and in many ways imaginary. They're not like, there's no wall. Well, there is a wall. Let's talk about the 8 Mile Wall. Like I mentioned before, the only city border that's overtly discussed in the film is the 8 Mile line. And when people think of segregation and borders in Detroit, the 8 Mile line is definitely what comes to mind first. In films like 8 Mile or It Follows, the 8 Mile border is the definitive dividing line between lower income Black inner city areas and the white suburbs. Another reason why the 8 Mile line is such an iconic marker of segregation is because of the 8 Mile Wall, a 5-foot high, 1-foot thick wall spanning half a mile along 8 Mile Road, which was put up in 1941 as a literal divider between white neighborhoods north of the line and Black neighborhoods south of the line. This wall is actually still up today, and it's been painted with a bunch of street art and exists today as a pretty haunting reminder of Detroit's past and current racial divides. We see that the people who live on the south side are not afforded the same privileges as people in the suburbs. Jay and her friends are explained how to live with the disease, but when they pass it on to sex workers on the south side, we can only assume they're not warned. When Jay and her friends cross over the 8 Mile line while going to the pool towards the end of the film, I can't think but help of gentrification. There seems to be a definite fluidity between these borders. They're permeable in both directions. While there's a clear fear of decay coming from the suburbs, the movement of the white suburban kids to the other side is also affecting those communities. Detroit is currently in a period of both rapid change and stagnation, while both gentrification and fears of decay drift between its borders. One great thing that horror films can do beyond scare is to open up conversations about these fears we have as individuals and as a larger society. Like, think about it. Why is Detroit considered to be the perfect horror location to some? And from what vantage point are we watching these Detroit horror films? What does this say about our understanding of Detroit and the divides between the suburbs and the inner city? At the beginning of this video, I stated that all horror is political. But being political doesn't always mean being useful. When looking at images of very real ruin and decay in real neighborhoods that are undergoing mass transformations and have historically seen a lot of injustice, maybe inserting these questions into our viewing experiences of films like these can be a great opportunity to think critically about locations like Detroit. Okay, well, that's the end of the video. I had a lot of fun making this one. I learned a lot about Detroit. I hope you did too. I've really been enjoying making these videos. This is my second one. If you haven't seen my first one, it's up. I'm also really happy with it. If you want to like the video, if you want to subscribe, please subscribe. And if you want to share the video with friends, that would be amazing. Again, I love making these videos and I plan on releasing more. And with your help, I can spend more time making them. So yeah, thank you so much for watching.